Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Arelith. This time around, we're following in the footsteps of Arelith, a hard-working son of the desert. I thought I'd spice things up a bit and play something other than Alfred, and I do this quite often. I have various characters, most of which don't see the light of day for more than a couple of play sessions, but Arelith is one of the few characters I have played for some time, and actually kind of able to put together a character, because that's usually what it comes down to. When you make a character, you're not sure what the character's going to be like. You may have an idea, but as soon as you start playing, that's when you figure out, okay, well, he's going to be like this. He's going to like these things and dislike those things, and etc., etc. And another difference in this episode is that I felt like I needed to show you some combat for a change, some adventure. You know, we've been going through Alfred's adventures in the city that you might begin to think that that's all the server has to offer, but that is not true. It is not so. The Arelith is an island, right? Okay, but it's not like a small island. It's a fairly large one, and there's some other islands dotted around. But this one, we're still on the, well, I was going to say mainland, but Arelith proper, right? And we're on the coast. We're quite close to another town, actually, which is not Cawdor, where I usually frequent. But we came across this woman called Zajenka, and she has guided us to what we could call, for lack of a better word, a dungeon, because there's quite a few similarities between Arelith and MMORPGs. Or it tries to bridge the gap between a tabletop role-playing game in which you role-play and you do things. You roll dice, first of all. That's what Neverwinter does for you. But also the grindy, adventuring aspect of I guess World of Warcraft is the one that comes to mind. Not that I've ever played it myself, because I had Neverwinter Nights and also no money. And I think the main differences I find is the pacing. Normally when you go through a dungeon in an MMO, you want to speed things up, you want to do things proper. Obviously, if there's a boss fight, you don't want to rush things like a certain Jenkins, but you're not gonna artificially slow yourself down. Whereas on Arelith, you want to go slower because you want to give everybody the chance to type their reactions, right? It's all about still building your character and having interactions with one another, or the creatures that you're fighting, and the various dangers that you might encounter in this, or in any dungeon. And I think there have been role-playing servers or attempts to role-play on regular MMORPGs, but I feel like most of the time when it's down to combat, there's no time to emote because of the nature of the combat, whereas because Neverwinter Nights is turn-based, you kind of know your place in the combat, in the turn order. So if you've got 2 attacks, you can count them. Okay, I've done my 2 attacks. Now there's time for me to type things or use a healing kit and stuff like that. So you're never going to be blasted away all of a sudden, and you don't have to be always hands on deck at every single moment. So you can kind of relax and take a back seat and try to think of, what is my character thinking as I'm pummeling through these bandits? That's something you don't probably ever think about when you're playing other games. And it can be kind of way too slow-paced for someone who comes from another game where they expect, this isn't Diablo, you don't just rush through things and kill everything. We could just be running, but, that's kind of, I don't know if that's still frowned upon. There was a time when it was. But, I personally would not find that as enjoyable, because at the end of the day, we're not playing... If we wanted to play a grindy game, we'd find a better grindy game to play and advance in than Neverwinter Nights. Because, granted, Neverwinter Nights offers a lot of character customization in terms of multi-classing, because you can have 3 different classes. That's another topic entirely. The nature of the game is still kind of, it's still a tabletop game, so you wouldn't really get the same feeling of advancement, especially because experience gain is quite slow. So you wouldn't get the same satisfaction from simply running through a dungeon really fast all the time. But the main issue is the fact that everybody has to type everything. You're not on voice comms, and I've watched games, or I watched some games where voice comms are a way to roleplay, and for some reason I never quite got into that. I think it's because I like to think through my words, and I like to emote a lot more in certain cases. And sure, if the game offers you the chance to move your arms around and stuff, then you can kind of do that. But it's almost, I guess it comes down to the uncanny valley. So when people are actually using voice comms to chat with one another, and the characters that they use as avatars have these deadpan faces, it kind of takes me out of the experience. So whereas on Arelith, because you kind of, even though you're like typing stuff and your character doesn't necessarily do anything, because the characters are not quite as detailed as, say, Neverwinter Nights 2, which has characters that have like proper facial features and everything. You can kind of turn a blind eye to the fact that the characters are not actually doing the emotes, and you can start to use your imagination. I guess that's less of a problem with the voice comms as it is with modern titles anyway. But so the more advanced the graphics are, the more you rely on those graphics to portray what your character's movements are. And if you use, let's say in The Witcher, instead of Geralt moving around and talking, you'd just see text describing him doing this. It wouldn't be the same, right? So the further we advance, the more reliant we are on the characters to do what we desire. But herein lies the problem in combat and in high action situations, or in general, I guess in real life, when you emote, when you move your arms around, you make a face, everything's really fast. Like, that's the fastest form of expression. In a game like Arelith, on Neverwinter Nights, it's way slower. It's actually much faster to speak. And if you have been paying attention, neither of our characters have said a word. And I thought this was fantastic. When I first stumbled into Zhenka, I noticed that she didn't say anything. And after a while, I kind of responded in kind. Because even though my character does speak, he's kind of the sort of solemn, quiet type, like Teal'c from Stargate or something. And I decided to play along with it, if only to kind of respect the silence, so to speak, but also as a challenge for myself, because I wanted to see just how much I could convey through actions and emotions, or like gestures alone. I've played so many characters now, especially Alfred, who speak before they do anything. They talk a lot and they have a way with words, right? But when it comes to gestures, it's often very difficult to convey them. Like, I personally struggle a lot in describing what I want for everyone else to perceive. So if I raise an eyebrow, I want it to be raised in a particular way, but I don't know how to describe that. So a lot of eyebrows are raised, but not necessarily in the way I picture them, or the way you picture them. They might not be the same at all. So that sort of training, I felt like, was good. So this is all practice towards that. And I was really into it. I've seen a couple of characters who have attempted to be mute or deaf and have had to do this, have not been talking at all. And I think it's a very unique and difficult decision for a character. I don't actually know if Zhajenka is mute, per se, if she can speak or not. It kind of reminds me of those characters in movies who the protagonists find some helpless damsel or someone who is going to guide them, but they don't speak the same language, right? This person speaking a foreign language. Obviously, in our case, neither of us are speaking at all. And I kind of felt like I might have maybe should have tried to speak and break the silence, ask for confirmation, like, can you not speak? But I felt like that went against Warreeve's character, because Warreeve is this honor-bound warrior, right? He deals with situations in a different way than most of my other characters. So he probably didn't care to ask or see it his place to ask any such questions. Maybe he felt they were too personal. So in this case, we just left it at that and played along. Not that it would have prevented Warreeve from speaking, and this whole interaction could have gone with Warreeve being the one to talk and Zhajenka being the quiet one, which would have been perfectly acceptable. And in movies, when you see the protagonist find somebody who is not speaking their tongue, usually at the end or towards the end, there suddenly comes the revelation that they do speak the same language, or they do understand. They've just chosen not to speak, which I've always found a very convoluted way of handling a situation, or like bringing some sort of friction between the two characters when quite clearly they can understand one another. And it's always at the point when they need some sort of clarity or whatever, when it's kind of too late to explain the situation, that's when they start explaining the situation. And it just bothers me. At least when done wrong. There are some other examples when it's done right, but anyway, this is all besides the point. So we've descended into the deeper dungeon. So yes, most of the dungeons on Arelith, this is probably the one I'm most familiar with, because usually my characters end up getting kind of stuck in their progression at this stage, and I've always just run this dungeon for whatever reason. I guess it's kind of the correct level of experience, but also the challenge level isn't too hard, and you can actually solo this place on some characters fairly easily. But partying up is a big bonus. Like, you get more experience from it, but also the added protection of having someone else with you is always good. You may have noticed that on occasion there pops up a message saying that Zhajenka protects Warreeve from an attack, What that means is it's an Arelith-specific feature, one of the many features on Arelith that have been added to the base game. And what it does is it's basically a taunt, right? It's normally when the enemy AI monsters choose their targets, they switch to somebody who has dealt them a serious blow. And part of the decision making is disrupted by this feature that allows you to guard one other person. So you can choose, say, a mage who is in the party to guard them. And whenever that mage throws a fireball someplace and all the enemies turn towards this frail mage, they make the decision to attack the person guarding instead. If you've seen, it's kind of similar to how Darkest Dungeon does the guarding. But basically you're the one who takes the aggression. And in my case, that was actually kind of helpful because Warriv is he's a monk, and monks usually have high armor, so technically it would have been fine not to guard me. But the thing is, Warriv is a strength character. I made this character years ago when I wanted to have a monk who used a quarterstaff. And back then, quarterstaff was primarily a strength weapon. They've since changed that, and now you can use a quarterstaff with your dexterity, which means that my character is, I guess, stronger in terms of brute force, and I quite like that in terms of character as well. But it would be so much better if I had a higher dexterity, because then I would scale better into late game, so to speak. I would have a character who does not get hit very often, and I would, I'd just be a better character. Period. I wouldn't need any protection from other players, other characters. Now, just then, you will have heard Zajenka shout out a battle cry of sorts. And it's at this point I wasn't sure how to take that, because Neverwinter Nights, by default, you make your character and you pick a voice set for your character. And in the vanilla version of Neverwinter Nights, you cannot choose a voice that is blank, so you don't have any voice lines at all. There are ways to do that, though. You can change the files so that you see the entire selection of the voice sets, and one among them is one of these that I've used quite often, actually. I think Alfred has that as his voice set, is the one where he doesn't speak. And the reason I usually choose this is because I don't know what my character's voice is going to be. What's he going to sound like? What's he going to do? I don't know. I don't find the one voice that fits the character, so I don't choose any. I don't know if, in her case, she made the character without having the plan to be a mute, or if she was just unable to find the option to not have a voice. It could be either or she might have been able to speak, and that was in character. It's kind of hard to say, and a lot of the time, when people use their voice chat, which is like the voice set has a set list of responses. It's quite a few of them in some cases. But what tends to happen is that when you use it, the immediate response from other players is to repeat the same line if they happen to have the same voice set as you. And it just creates this weird, jarring situation where both of you kind of break the fourth wall because you sound exactly the same. But also, a lot of the replies repeat, or sometimes you just choose the wrong, like the response itself doesn't match what you thought it was. It's kind of like a BioWare dialogue option. In fact, isn't this a BioWare game? You make a choice and your character says something completely different. But I chose to ignore it, and in fact, I might have missed it at one point because I was more interested in what she did. So she was breathing fire or acid even, and I wasn't sure where that came from. So I was trying to look it up, how she did all that, and I'm still not quite sure, because the game does have a character class which allows you to do that, but also there could be some custom features that I'm not aware of. It might have been some item, just, some weird acid spray type of mixture, a one-use item that you throw or whatever. Could have been anything, but I'm not quite sure what it was. So that was what caught my attention primarily at the time. Another thing that is mostly ignored is whatever your character says when talking to an NPC, because the response is always the same. So when you see somebody talking to another NPC, in this case she types her response in, she's gesturing towards the exit, but then when she chooses the dialogue option, her character still speaks. And pretty much nobody takes that stuff in character, because you could have, it just doesn't work, because you always say the same things. I'm not really sure if there's a solution to that. Maybe just having quiet, kind of just actions rather than words. But they're mostly for you anyway, those dialogue options, if you were kind of playing it on your own. So it's just one of those things that you either choose to ignore or not. But it's like an unwritten rule that they're not in character replies. At least not word for word. The gist is the same, obviously, because you want to perform that action. In our case, we released some prisoners and gained experience for it. We're heading towards the end of the dungeon where the boss lies. And every dungeon has one, I think. Most dungeons have one anyway. Just like in other games like this. And killing bosses is usually the primary source of experience and good loots. So that's why you go there. Or maybe not the loot itself, but the experience certainly. And you get money from them because you can collect bounties from bosses by taking out their heads. Here's another feature that Arelith offers. You can capture enemies with an item, with a rope, a lasso. The opponent has to be low health, and what actually happens here is that we stopped just short of killing this guy. My final attack does 9 damage, but that's only because the Morgoon soldier resists 1 point of damage. So that's why he survived, which I find hilarious. So now you can do this to creatures as well. I don't know if it's only for humanoids, like what the limitations are. But now this bandit is tethered to a Zajenka with this rope. and is added to the party. Technically, he is now a henchman. He just doesn't fight for us, and he's well, that's like the whatever. He's part of the party, and the reason you do this is to eventually get some sort of a reward for turning them in to the authorities, right? But first, we must prepare ourselves for the boss fight. One of the main things I like about Neverwinter Nights combat is that it handles like any other game with combat, like in terms of like the real-time aspects of it are so smooth that you kind of forget that you're rolling dice. And that's what makes it so intriguing for me, because you can see the dice rolls happening, and you always see like when you miss and when you hit, when you roll ones and when you roll 20s, and you can kind of get the same thrill of the dice as you would in a tabletop game. However, it's just handled so much quicker. A lot of the time in tabletop games, the combat is bogged down by players overthinking their decisions or just having really bad rolls. Like, take this fight for instance. Can you picture how long this fight would take with the same roll results that we're getting right now? A lot of misses, like both sides are missing their attacks time and time again. It would take hours just to do this fight in a tabletop setting. At least if the players wanted to think of their decision making, and it would just be horrible. A slugfest, so to speak. Now, considering I'm playing a melee-oriented character, I don't really have many choices to make. My only choice is to attack, and that's always the case on lower level characters that don't do magic. It's always the same. You attack, and you attack, and you attack again. I have knockdown, or improved knockdown actually, so that offers me some choice. I also have cold shot, which is horrible, I know, but stop shouting inoptimal at me. So I have some choices, but they're not very impactful, and it's if this were any slower, if the attacks did not happen almost instantaneously, like one after the other, the flow of combat is very well done in Neverwinter Nights, and in particular the animations. What I really liked about this game that I disliked in Neverwinter Nights 2 is the fact that there are so many variations to the combat animations. Like, there's many times when the characters... I think in Neverwinter Nights 2, every time you missed an attack, you made your attack and it missed, but there was no proper animation for the missing. You just missed, right? The other side didn't take any steps left or right or backwards or anything like that. In this game, you duck around, you block with your shield, you block it with your weapon, and sparks are flying all over the place. I think that's the coolest one, when you have two people with swords and they just keep parrying each other's blows, and it just looks epic, particularly when you have a lot of attacks and neither side is hitting. But also, if you have a well-rounded character, you can do some really powerful critical hits that splatter the enemies all over the floor, and it's the most glorious thing in the world. I'm talking about you weapon masters. You all know who you are. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Zajenka is either going to be or is already a weapon master, because she has whirlwind attack, and that is a feat that nobody takes unless they are going to be weapon masters, simply because it costs a lot of feats to get that feat. It's quite handy. You can do like a spinny attack and hit everyone around you, but the investment is way too much for just that. And weapon masters themselves gain a lot of critical bonuses, which is why everybody plays them. But we're out of the dungeon. We got through the portal, and we're back on the surface. This is one of those MMO features that everyone's familiar with. A dungeon that only has one entrance. Because nobody wants to walk back the way they came. A lot of the time, actually, some parties end up at the boss room without resources to head back up. And I really like the convenience. I think everybody does. But it's the Skyrim effect of you go through a dungeon and then you realize that there was a tiny hole that you could have entered into that back room from the other side and skip the entire dungeon that way. But you're never allowed to do that. So it's kind of ridiculous. But I guess it's something to sacrifice for convenience. Here we are, we have arrived in Wharf Town. This is one of the other cities besides Cawdor. Although I hear some bad things may have happened to Wharf Town of late. I haven't played in a while, so this was obviously recorded ages ago. But that concludes our session for today. I hope you have enjoyed this visit on Arelith. A bit different from the usual, and I hope to see you all next time. Until then, my name is Duke. Goodbye.